The Bread and Better podcast acknowledges the Yagara people and the Turrbal people as the traditional custodians of Meanjin, the lands on which we record today. We pay our respects to the Yagara and Turrbal elders, past, present, and emerging. This podcast is brought to you by Hey Al Productions.
Did I say good? Did I get you to do it one more time?
Maybe just in case.
Okay, do it one more time. Go. Bread and Better podcast. Okay. Bread and Better podcast. I feel like I am. Bread and Better podcast.
Welcome to Bread and Better, a women's holistic health podcast where we believe that better begins with us. I'm Alex, the co-host and producer of this show. I'm a freelance writer, I own Hale Productions, and I also work in film.
And I'm Tegan. I'm a sports nutritionist, personal trainer, and chef. I host Bread and Better alongside Alex, as well as running my business Fitty Teagues, in which I specialise in female transformations. Today we are welcoming back Natalie Douglas, who you may have heard on our amazing contraception episode. Last time we had Nat on the podcast, it was in a professional context, whereas today we'll be hearing from her more on a personal level. We're absolutely delighted to have you back, Nat. So thank you for being with us and thank you for being open to the conversation that we're planning to have today.
Oh, so welcome. I'm excited to be back and having this conversation because I feel like it's a really necessary one and an interesting one, and I think the more conversations around this are out there, it's easier for people to not feel so alone in the experience.
Okay, so before we get into today's episode, we would like to issue a content warning. In this episode, we will be discussing mental health issues, specifically eating disorders. If this is something you find triggering, please feel free to go back and listen to one of our previous episodes. Otherwise, we will be back in your ears next week with a much more lighthearted episode. If you do choose to listen and it brings anything up for you, we recommend reaching out to Lifeline or the Butterfly Foundation, and you can find links to those organisations in our show notes.
All right, so we're going to start our podcast the way we always do. So we love to start with some food positivity, and we're going to be talking about the best thing that we ate in the last week. As our guest, we'll let you go first, Nat.
Oh my gosh, you know what's funny? I'm like, am I going to say the same thing I said last time? So I'm going to try and think of something different that I didn't say last time. What have I had in the last week? I'm such a creature of habit that I eat the same things all of the time.
Yeah.
But I feel like actually something so simple, but my husband cooked for me, which is a rare occasion, so I relish in this. And he made the most delicious chips in the air fryer. We have like a low tox air fryer that's just glass. Yeah. And you know Mingle, the brand Mingle, they have seasonings. The garlic and herb one, bit of olive oil, the chippies, so good. And then just had it with a really delicious salad and some chicken. And you know how sometimes simple just makes you happy? I was so happy. Plus a little bit of butter on the chips always makes me extra.
Yum. So good.
Yeah. What about you guys?
So I went to Honto on Saturday with my family and I had a cocktail and it was like a peach something gin, and then it had like a peach, puree thing on top.
Ooh.
It was incredible. Like every sip of it was like to die for.
How good.
So good. And then I had a dessert that was like, I'd say maybe one of the best things I've ever eaten in my life.
That is a big call. What was this dessert? We need to know.
It was like it was all obviously gluten-free, dairy-free. It was a burnt pineapple praline. So then it had like some delicious like toasty crumb, and then it had a layer of like coconut ice cream, and then coconut cream that was infused with matcha, and the coconut cream kind of tasted like, on top of the Florence drinks that we get.
Yum.
So it was heavenly.
She has been living her best life over here.
Yeah, birthday week.
It is Leo season.
It is.
The last time I went to Honto, they had really strange desserts and they were both nice, but there was one that was like, it was like a miso flavored dessert and the other one was like a mushroom flavored ice cream.
I don't know if I could get behind ordering that.
I like miso in desserts.
I went with Emmy. It was ages ago. Anyway, they were both really kooky desserts, but nice. Not making the cut for this. Mine is also really simple. For my dinners, I've been having I've been roasting in the oven just sweet potato, pumpkin, and zucchini, and just like a little bit of olive oil, salt and pepper that goes in the oven. And then I've been cooking chicken thigh, and then take that out, a bit of butter, mushroom, onion, garlic, a little bit of cream, and a little bit of chicken gravox to make like a mushroom sauce. Chicken goes back in, whole thing goes on top of the roast veggies.
Yum.
This creativity.
So good.
I couldn't keep track of that when you were saying it, but can you text
part
this to
do you
me?
want me to go back to?
No, don't say it now. Just text it to me.
can-
I
you can
won't retain it.
You can
anyway.
re-listen in the edit anyway.
Yeah.
I can listen again and take notes.
I would make the recipe for reels, but it's not very aesthetic. Like it just looks like a bunch of stuff. Like,
But the best food always looks like terrible.
yeah, that's true.
The tastiest.
My like little chef brain still needs things to look pretty if I'm going to post them.
Can you like plate it up?
I
Like,
could, but
pretty?
I even when I cook it, I cut the veggies really small to roast them because they cook
Get
faster
crispier,
and they get a
okay.
bit crispier. And then I like bring the thigh out and then I cut it all up and then I chuck it back in the sauce so that I can eat the entire thing with a fork.
Yeah.
So it's not aesthetic at all.
Not a single
This sounds
efficient step
bloody
has been
delicious.
missed.
I'm an efficient gal. Everything is done
Yeah.
with a certain outcome in mind. But yeah, it's really good. That's been my dinner this week.
Oh, okay. I'm so excited. I'm going to make this next week.
So as we said earlier, our regular listeners will have all met Nat before when she came in for our incredibly informative contraception episode. Nat is a naturopath and dietitian specialising in thyroid, gut and hormone healing.
After the episode we recorded previously, Nat and I talked briefly about her experience with an eating disorder in her teen years, and we thought that we would carry that conversation on today as it is still something that is not talked about a lot in the media. And as Nat said before, we think it's really important. So Nat, thank you again for coming on today and sharing this story with us. It is a difficult discussion, so we really appreciate your time today. So let's get started. Can you tell us a little bit about your eating disorder?
I can. And of course, everyone's experience is unique, though if you are someone with an eating disorder or you know someone who has, there are always common threads through it. So from my experience in a very, I guess, just starting with the logistical stuff, I first developed a disordered eating pattern or an eating disorder around the age of about 12, like 12 and a half. And I probably wouldn't say that I was out of the eating disorder until I was about 20, 21. It's a little bit difficult to say because it's not like there's a moment where you've got an infection and then you don't have an infection, you have an eating disorder, you don't. It's a journey of recovery. So I would say I was mostly recovered by about that time. And for me, in my experience, the trigger for my eating disorder was basically I lost my grandma at the time when I was about 12, who I had lived with, and she had Alzheimer's. So I was really heavily involved in helping care for her, even though I was only about, 10 to 12 years old when that was happening. And when she passed away, I was naturally really upset. And, when you're really upset, you tend not to eat. And so it wasn't at all a conscious thing at first. I was just upset, going through my own version of grief as a 12-year-old, didn't eat as much. And because I was quite a big eater, there was a big difference between me eating and me not eating. And I noticed that I was starting to lose weight only through other people's comments of being like, oh, wow, you've lost some weight. What have you been doing? And I think naturally being a little bit of a type A personality back then, or a bit of a high achiever, so to speak, it's kind of like I heard those, what felt like to me, compliments, and was like, oh, yeah, I have. And I'm getting attention and recognition and acknowledgement for this. So I'm going to try to maybe keep doing this. But it was from that avenue of more of that attention validation initially. And my initial attempts at losing weight were not actually heavily involved in food restriction at that time. I was more just trying to quote unquote eat healthy. But as time went on and I naturally was in my head I want to get better at this, I started to learn about calories. I started to track them, count them. And I guess the more I went down that path, the more weight I lost, the more attention I got. And as I lost more and more weight, the attention kind of got less just oh, wow, you've lost weight, and then started to err more into sometimes concern. And to me, though, it was all one and the same. It was all like
Yeah.
validation and intention. And at some point, and I couldn't tell you at what point in the journey, the reason for me started to shift more into it was something that I could control. And in my home environment, there was, I mean, I have a beautiful mum, but I also had other adult humans in my life that were not a safe space for me, and I felt incredibly unsettled around. And there was a lot of elements within that space or that environment that felt very outside of my control. So food and exercise and my weight became something that I could control and calmed the anxiety that I was feeling internally. And of course, like I'm saying all of this very articulately in hindsight. It's not something I was conscious of at the time. All I knew was like, this is helping me feel calm. But then you get into, or I got into this, cycle of then anytime I stepped out of that, my anxiety would just increase tenfold. So it just was like a non-negotiable. I could not step out of that space. And I didn't really seek any help or realize there was a problem until maybe I was about 15 or so. And, I was recognizing maybe what I was doing wasn't super healthy, and I could see my mum was a bit concerned, and I was super close with my mum. And, I said I'd be willing to go and see a dietitian. And to be honest, the main reason I went was to try and make my mum feel a little bit more comfortable, and because I liked feeling like I was being cared for.
Yeah.
So it was very much, I didn't want to get better. Like I did not want to put on weight. I didn't want to get out of the cycle I was in, but it felt almost validating and like nurturing to be taken to all of these appointments and to have the attention focused on me, and to feel like people were paying attention to me, that something wasn't right, even though what they were paying attention to wasn't really the actual thing that wasn't right, if that makes sense.
Yeah. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Yes. Hearing you say that, I don't have this experience myself, but I, as we'll get into, have experienced an eating disorder in my family. So I'm not going to go into their story too much, but as you're just saying all of that, like that's how I imagined my sister felt at the time. Yeah, I don't want to talk for her, but just hearing you say like having that feeling cared for. I remember because there was 4 kids in our family, so I imagine that was not nice, but like you didn't often get that one-on-one kind of attention. So I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, and again, it's kind of not this really conscious thing that I feel like I went through and acknowledged, but in hindsight, I can really see that. And then as time went on, I had psychologists involved, and that again just was even better, because it was like then in psychology you're actually speaking about yourself and your feelings, and that felt again really validating and really special to have that. But there was always this big contrast of feeling very guilty for me, because I could see how much it was affecting my mum in particular.
Yeah.
And I probably, for people out of curiosity, like I probably got down to about 40 to 42 kilograms, and I'm only a short person, like 153 centimeters for anyone who's taking track, but it was significant. I didn't end up in hospital. There was a lot of times where I was threatened to be put in there, but I had a friend who I used to do soccer with who was in and out of rehab for eating disorders, and I knew what went on in hospitals and in eating disorder clinics in terms of really close monitoring and, for lack of a better word, force feeding. And I just could not let myself get to that point. So I always managed to kind of toe the line where I wouldn't go down into that path.
Yeah.
But like touching on what you said there about being someone who was in a family with someone who was navigating an eating disorder, I find that really interesting, because I have a brother and he's older than me, and I never, to be completely honest, at the time of moving through all of it, I never ever considered his feelings or his experience in what I was moving through. And what I'm curious about there is, sharing on the attention aspect that naturally parents are driven towards, because there's a crisis at hand. Did you feel any effects of that in terms of, did you feel angry at your sibling? Did you feel confused? Did you consider having an eating disorder yourself? Like, what went on for you?
Yes. So I was very conflicted. My sister did go into hospital and she was in there for a long time. At first she was kind of in and out, but then she was in there, I don't actually know how long. It was a long time, over like months. And then she ended up in Bronte's clinic and it went on for a few years, like quite a long time, all quite similar, same age and everything that started with you. And I felt very conflicted because I felt angry because I didn't understand at all. I just wanted her to eat. And so like at dinner time, I just would be like so upset. I just couldn't understand at all like why she wouldn't do it. And we'd have big conversations and I feel like I would make some progress and then she would go back to her kind of patterns and then I'd feel really disheartened. So yeah, I was very angry all the time, but then also I felt like so guilty. Like I felt really like every time. So sometimes she'd come home on the weekends and then like she would go back to hospital or when I'd visit her in hospital and I'd leave her there. It was just like the worst thing I think I'd ever kind of like experienced. I just felt it's like it's a horrible, horrible place to be. So it was just like it was just like the worst thing imaginable really. And I just had so much resentment for her just for what it did to like my family. And then I just felt really guilty all the time because I felt like that. And then obviously I missed her. Like we were very close. Like she's 2 years younger than me. And it was very, and obviously all of the attention was kind of like on her, but I just took that time, like I really focused on my little brother and sister because they were like 2 and 4. So I just like they were my whole world and I just put all my energy into like looking after them and caring for them. But yeah, I didn't develop an eating disorder myself, but I started getting panic attacks and that's where my anxiety kind of started as well. Just from being, I think that it was from being in the hospital visiting her and I had a fear of hospitals for like the longest time.
Yeah.
So, yeah, it was
big.
Yeah, horrific.
Yeah, that's interesting in terms of that, like you went into that caretaker role for everyone else in that regard. And it's really difficult and to navigate the emotional landscape of that as a young person. I mean, it's difficult even as an older person if you're in that kind of situation because there are all these conflicting feelings going on and also conflicting needs. And if you are someone that has emotional intelligence, emotional awareness, you're not going to be, you're not going to be able to ignore the feelings and the emotions that are around you.
Yeah.
But I think at such a young age and such a formative age, it's almost like you don't have as much internal resource or external resource to really know how to handle things in the best possible way across the board. And that's a huge thing to be pushed into as someone who's not the parent, and not at all placing blame on parents. Like, God, it's a nightmare to try and live with someone with an eating disorder because it is exactly what you've said. It's as someone watching on, I imagine, so frustrating because the solution, right, seems so simple.
Yeah, it does.
And my brother also has anxiety, and I think there are more reasons than just my disordered eating, but I'm sure that it didn't help.
Yeah.
And I think, when there's so much need and energy that goes into one child, also like the bandwidth for the other children in either a positive or just a capacity way is so much less.
Yeah.
And whether you can articulate that or understand it in that moment, you'd certainly feel it as a kid. And clearly your coping mechanism was like, all right, well, I better step up. I better take care of these other children that have needs.
Yeah.
But in that, it's kind of like yours aren't met as much. And then it would, so hard to feel that confliction of like, I deeply love my sister and care for her, and also just eat. Like,
Yeah. Yeah, there was so many. It is. You can articulate it so much better than I can, because this is, like I said before, I don't speak about this with anyone. My family don't speak about it, so I feel like I haven't quite got there with like how to express it all. But it's so frustrating, because at the time I was like, 16. So I was literally like, the food is there, eat it, and then you won't have to go to hospital. And obviously as an adult with hindsight and having mental illness myself, I can see that everything, like nothing was intentional. She didn't mean it. Like she couldn't have changed it. So you still like experience that guilt as an adult as well. And now I feel, I would say like I feel even worse for her in hindsight, because I know that we expressed so much frustration towards her, and I just can't imagine how awful that was for her as well. And I imagine for you going through that, like feeling that frustration at the time.
I feel like from my experience of the frustration, because absolutely I felt that at times from people around me, I felt guilty and I felt angry myself, because I didn't want to have them suffer, but I also could not manage my internal anxiety landscape in any other way. So it felt like being torn between, both of those situations. But what I would say, which may or may not help you, is that I also had, my dad in my life who didn't give a shit, basically. And so to have care, even if that was expressed by a frustration, in hindsight and even in the moment, felt more important than ambivalence, which was expressed from my dad, because then it felt like I'm not even being seen in my suffering, even though the alternative, or how sometimes it was received from people who really did care, was like, why can't you just eat? Or, because also you're human, your parents are human. And I honestly, prior to having an eating disorder, I also wouldn't have understood how not simple it is to quote unquote just eat. So I think the fact that the intention and the real essence behind it is love and care, and just wanting to have her feel safe and happy and supported again, and go back to a lot of the bonds and the mental and emotional capacity that opens up in both of your lives and your connection. I think that that's inherently very pure and good.
Yeah.
And it's kind of that notion of so many different things can exist in one time. You can deeply love her and be frustrated. And as a mum now, I'm sure that you can like connect that back of like, yes, I love my children to bits, but oh my God, would you just like do this now?
Yeah. It's so true. That's very true. And it's so the parallels, like I don't like calling my stepdad, but just for context of this story, my mum and my stepdad just did like everything to try and help her. Like it was financially huge. Obviously she was in the public system, but having to give up like time to be there and everything. And then obviously when she went to Bronte's clinic, like there was a lot of cost involved with that. And my like real dad, our biological dad, just honestly was like, he'd fly up like once or twice to see her, but he just didn't, I just don't think, he just didn't care. He didn't think that, he doesn't really believe in mental illness. And I think that I remember that really impacting her more, and her trying to reach out to him more. And that like at the time that felt frustrating too, because I was like, we all care about you so much, like why are you, but that makes sense to me now. That does make me feel better actually, you saying because all you want to do is like help them, but you obviously have no idea how to do that. And obviously back then, like this was early 2000s, and there was not a big discussion around mental health at all. Like no one really understood. No one knew how to like talk to me about it. Like people at school, teachers and stuff would try and talk to me about it. And I was like, you all have like no idea what's happening.
Absolutely. Yeah, I can resonate with that. And also to reflect back, like another hopeful reassurance is, to be honest, there's not really anything quote unquote right you can say to someone in the middle of an eating disorder. I would twist people's words to whatever narrative was going to suit the one that I wanted. So if someone, as a very trivial example of that, if I was starting to get a little bit better, i.e. I was eating a little bit more and I'd stopped losing weight and someone said, oh, you're looking healthy, Nat, I'd be like, great, I'm fat. I'm getting fatter.
Yeah.
And that's the way it would twist. Or if someone would say, you know, oh gosh, like express concern of you've really lost more weight, like you're looking quite gaunt, I would take that as a compliment of like, great, I'm doing a good job. I'm achieving what I wanted to achieve and I'm receiving, you know, attention essentially. And when I reflect back on all of the support people I had in my world, whether they were, you know, active participants or just happened to be in my world in the way of friends, I was very lucky to have friends that were there for me and happy to have conversations, but truly did not ever comment on my body.
Yeah.
And at the time I was frustrated by that because I wanted the attention and I wanted validation or some kind of, again, thing I could latch onto to fit the narrative that I had in my head that was suiting the disorder that I was existing in. But they just kind of remained very neutral. And ultimately that helped towards the end because when I made the decision for myself that I wanted to get better, which is really the only place in which you can truly help someone is when they decide that's the fight that they want to fight and that's the end result that they want. It helped so much to have a space where I'd been 10 billion different sizes and they'd not blinked an eye, and it just felt like I could then change and it wouldn't mean anything in those relationships.
Yeah.
But it's just incredibly difficult because you are going through as an onlooker, I imagine, because I've spoken a lot with my mum about it in terms of her experience, and you know, she would tell you that you're trying to toggle between not wanting to push this person further away from you, but also knowing that if you don't say anything and if you don't do something, that they have the ability to literally starve themselves to death.
Yeah.
And, you know, I can imagine the weight of that, especially not spoken about in your family, would have been felt tenfold because when things aren't spoken about and they aren't voiced, we all just make our own meaning from it. And I think that's really, really hard and hard at any age, but particularly at the age you were at, being a support person and also knowing that every family member deals with things differently.
Yeah.
I think that just would have been so difficult. And, you know, really we're all just doing the best we can at each point along the journey with the resources and information that we have. Were you, out of curiosity, were you ever offered support, like as in as a family, as you as a sibling to someone with an eating disorder, were you ever offered counselling or support?
One doctor spoke to me one time and heavily implied that it was my fault because I had called her Fatty Boomba when she was little, was one of the nicknames when she was like a toddler.
What child hasn't been called Fatty Boomba? I've been called Fatty Boomba.
And obviously I was the big sister and we have very different personalities, and so it was implied a few times that it's because I had always gotten all of the attention growing up because I was like loud and dramatic and stuff, and she didn't get as much attention. So like it was implied like in discussions that I was involved in or overheard that I had led to some of that, which was like a guilt that I carried for like a really long time until I think I've had like one conversation with her as an adult about it. And she was like, had nothing to do with you. And obviously I understand that now, having done my own research and stuff like that. But no, so I wasn't offered support. I don't think my parents were offered any support. I kind of didn't even talk to anyone about it until I was pregnant with Magnolia.
Wow.
So that was like 6 years ago. I kind of just like buried it very deep. But yeah, were they ever offered any support?
I don't think so, to be honest. Not that I'm aware of, though, when you are or when I was anorexic, I lived in my own little bubble.
Yeah.
So I couldn't even tell you half the things that went on. I was just living in my little anxious bubble of trying to be skinny and control everything around me. I couldn't tell you. But I find that really, really upsetting to hear because I think that you're never responsible for anyone else's journey entirely. And certainly in that context, it's kind of like kids are going to be kids, and I think there's name calling and nicknames in
Right.
every kind of situation. And if that was the only thing that could be a contributing factor, we'd all have anorexia, because I'm sure we've all been called names by our siblings.
Yeah, exactly.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
But it's really sad that it's not a conversation that is talked about, or that the people around are not offered support, because I think this extends to any kind of mental illness. And I would say, in my experience, anorexia is a mental illness, and it manifests physically as well. But mostly what drives it is that mental illness. And I mean, I know personally what it's like to support someone through depression, for example, or someone who's suicidal, and the weight on the person who is supporting someone moving through mental health is huge. And I think the more there's secrecy about it within relationship, within families, even within cultures, it's a breeding ground for like more shame, more guilt, more spiraling, more stories, more meaning made up about the situation. And I think it really should be, I feel like, a conversation where, in that context, you being younger in that situation, certain conversations you shouldn't have been involved in. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
To hear that, of course you're going to make it about you and carry that load. And then I think there also should be a more of an effort to help people who are supporting people with eating disorders to understand, because that frustration is so natural and normal and understandably should be there. And I don't think that understanding would take away the frustration, but at least it's just adds something. It adds context at least.
I think it would be, so beneficial to have it explained to you properly as any member of the family, because if you don't know the details of it, if you don't understand how it works. And I just remember the language used around her. I just remember so many people being like, she's selfish, she's manipulative, which I guess some of the behaviors could definitely come across as that, because same thing would manipulate things that you said, would manipulate things that other family members had said, but it's all a part of the disease.
Yeah.
And I feel like, even obviously you're still going to be frustrated and upset, but if you had a little bit of understanding, you just give it a little bit more grace maybe. Because I think I said this very early on, and I may have said it to you as well. The first time I've ever heard a sibling talk about their experience with having a sibling with anorexia was Hugh on The Imperfects, and it's the first time I've ever heard my experience reflected in someone else. And he says the same thing, that he was just so angry and had, so much guilt about that as he got older. But even me saying that, that's the only time I've ever heard that. And I still don't understand a lot about anorexia. I only understand what I saw and what I've read, what I've spoken about with other people that had it as well. But I think when I try and explain my family's experience, the only way I could explain it is like a horror movie.
Yeah.
I don't think, if you haven't been there before, it's very, very hard to understand how scary it is, having to go to a mental, children's mental ward, and the things that you see in there, and just some of the, it's horrifying. My sister almost died a few times. So it's very, very scary.
It's huge. And watching someone become a different person, as in the sister that had anorexia is not the sister that you knew pre-anorexia.
No, not at all.
And you literally become a different person. As an example, I'll use my own experience. I, pre-anorexia, happiest kid, free spirit, life of the party, goes with the flow, just loved life. And as I got further into that, and also very non-judgmental, as in I was the kid at school that the teacher, if there was ever a new kid, they'd be like, could you please, stay with the new kid today?
Yeah.
I was that person. And then as I went further into my eating disorder, of course there were elements of me that were still me, but I was I was much more serious. I apparently went with my mum to a shopping centre, and we're in the food court, and I don't recall saying this, but she wouldn't make up lies. But she said, we were in there and you said to me, look at this is disgusting. Look at all these people eating and just sitting down. And I think about like that now, being me, back to being me, and I go, oh my gosh, I cannot believe that I said that. And I think the way to explain it to people who haven't lived through anorexia is that it is absolutely not about the food. It's about the control that you have that then does something for you internally to soothe whatever feelings you cannot navigate without that tool. And you're not aware of that consciously. That's just how it feels internally. And basically, to bring some science into it very loosely, your actual brain does change the further you get through that starvation cycle, in that there are depletions in zinc, there are changes to histamine, which influence your appetite, influence literally your mental health and your neurotransmitters. And so initially it's behavior change, and then as you get further along and you progress further along, there are actual changes to your brain chemistry and changes to your appetite regulation that happen. And I remember in my experience when I was fairly deep into my eating disorder and very much addicted to exercise, I would go for a run, come back, look at my thighs in the mirror and be like, they've shrunk a little bit, that's great. Yeah. I'd go and have an apple. I'd go back to the mirror and be like, oh, I get overwhelmed with anxiety, and I would literally physically see that my thighs had grown, which had not happened in reality, but I saw that with my eyes. So it's very, as much as outside looking in, it seems very simple and it seems very fixable. And in one essence, the solution is simple, but it's not easy. Yeah. From the experience of the person with anorexia, it is very much a different perception. Like you're feeling and you're perceiving things very differently. And it's like, I imagine, an addict in terms of you do become manipulative, you do become controlling, you are addicted essentially to being thin, controlling food, for some people over-exercising, and without leaning into that or without using that, it's almost like you cannot cope. Yeah. And for people who have experienced anxiety, they can probably attest to that, or I imagine OCD could attest to that as well, as there's these certain things you must do or that you can't do in order to be able to feel like you can exist in your body and in your mind. Yeah. And I think that's the part that's oversimplified. I think it's missed because external, it's such an easy thing to focus on if it just looks like you're either putting on weight or you're not. Yeah. But internally there's just so much more going on than that. And the fact that it is very much something for a lot of families, I think, just really difficult to know how to navigate, how to handle, how to have conversations around, that breed further into creating more stress and more isolation. It's almost like it becomes a silo of just perpetuating the issue and then having that start to further and further impact everyone that's involved. Yeah. And as the person who's going through the anorexia, you are quite unaware of that because all of your attention and your focus is on trying to navigate your own internal emotional landscape, and it's hard all round.
Yeah, exactly what you've just said. Anything that you could say could be the wrong thing to say, so you don't talk. Like I just remember so many like silent dinners, like just sitting there, because if you, like you said, if you say, oh, you're looking healthy, she would take that as I look fat. Or if you say you're looking too thin, I'm worried about you, that would be, oh, I'm achieving my goal. So yeah, you do just end up sitting around not saying anything, and then that's making everything worse.
Yeah, and it's walking on eggshells, and I'm sure whether you've been in this situation or not, like people can imagine being in a situation where you're like, oh, I just don't want to say the wrong thing. Yeah. And to live in that anxious state is horrible for everyone involved, and then to further not have a safe space where you can express and say what you're thinking and feeling, especially the part that are the emotions that we as a society aren't as accepting of, like anger in particular. I wasn't in your part of the journey, but I imagine if I was, I would feel really bloody angry.
Yeah.
Because this person has a really simple change that they could make that would then make all of these other problems that are manifesting financially, emotionally, time-wise, just go away. Like we could just go back. And I think that what I would encourage people to think about is that those feelings and those emotions can exist alongside feeling empathy and compassion and for the experience that anorexic person is having. I think the notion that only one thing can exist at one time is just oversimplification of how we work as humans.
Yeah, that's so true.
Yeah. If you could go back in time and give support to your younger self, what kind of conversation would you have wanted to have, or what kind of support would you have wanted to have in place, knowing that you can't change the experience of your sister was having, but to have more support for you or a space for you? What do you think that would, like, what help would you have liked back then?
Yeah, I think I would have just been like it would have been nice to have been told that it wasn't my fault by a professional. I think like family members definitely told me that, but you don't really believe them. Yeah. So I think hearing that would have been really nice. That probably would definitely be the main thing, because that really affected me for like a very, very long time. And then I think just like education, like mainly just, and on a scientific level, like the way you just explained it, like I feel like that's something most people can hold on to, and like that, because that's an actual explanation. Like at the time I didn't know any of that. So if someone had sat me down and was like, this is how her brain's operating right now, or just even a path, if someone had have said, you know, it will eventually get better, which I mean, maybe probably people couldn't have seen, because at the time what I was witnessing from the people around her was that it wasn't going to get better. If I could go back and tell speak to my younger self and say that like eventually it will end. Because I think that was the worst part, was just like I thought that was going to be like, I thought either she was going to die or that was going to be my life forever.
Yeah.
And her life forever. Like I couldn't see it getting better. And same thing, she didn't really, I mean, it's something like that I think a lot of people, it sounds like, you know, you've got a lot of education around health and stuff, but I think for a lot of people it's something that they might continue to deal with at different points throughout their life. But for her, in her early 20s, she started to get a lot better. And I think and I used to worry about her so much in the world after that, like everything. I would just really inject myself into her life, and like I was just so overprotective. I think the first time I ever felt like I didn't have to do that was when she fell pregnant with my niece, and she really just like thrived into this very different person. And that was the first time I felt like I had like my sister back. And so yeah, I think just to be told that eventually it does end and it will get better, although I understand that that's very hard to say.
Yeah. Just some validation and reassurance, I think, makes such a difference, and to bring light to some of the shadow aspects of what you were feeling around anger and guilt and confusion, because it doesn't always feel like there's much space for that, I can imagine, in those spaces. And that just, as I said before, really like it's just a breeding ground, like silence and non-communication is just a breeding ground for more, you know, shame and guilt versus bringing that into the light and being vulnerable and having a space to actually say how you're going to feel without the worry of how that's going to affect someone, I think is so important when you're navigating that, no matter what age you are, for sure.
Yeah. And I think what you've just said before as well, that would have been so nice to be told that it's okay to have more than one emotion at once. Like, yes, I could have felt guilty and be angry and be hopeful, like that you can feel different things, and just because you're angry doesn't mean you don't have empathy. That would have been, I think that's a really good thing to
better late than never then.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. At what point and like how do you feel like you kind of came out of that, and then how did you recover as a family?
Great question. So to answer the first one, there was actually a moment in time for me, which I don't know that's the same for everybody. But for me, I remember I'd come out of the dietitian's office again, and I'd lost more weight, and we were at this really sticky point again that I'd constantly, toe the line with being put into hospital versus not. And, I had lost weight and they were threatening to put me into hospital. Me and my mum walked out, and as I've said earlier in the podcast, me and my mum so close, like ridiculously close, and always have been. And she wasn't ever really someone, we didn't have much discipline, and in terms of we were quite good kids, so there was no reason for it. And also she hadn't really ever yelled at me up until this point. And we got in the car and she just broke down. She just was, when someone's actually full toddler type crying, she was just distraught. And I'd never seen her like this in my whole life. And she just was angry as well. She was really angry. I imagine probably some of the anger that you were feeling. And she just said, you can't keep doing this. Like, you're not just killing yourself, you're killing me. Like, you're killing me. And she just kept kind of expressing all this anger and this pain and this hurt that I think I really personally, and this won't work for everyone, but I personally really needed to see, because it was that moment that I still didn't want to get better, but I also came in full contact with just the weight of what my choices were doing to the most important person in my life. And she was my whole world. And so to see her so distraught and so heartbroken and so angry, I was like, oh my gosh, I feel worse about doing this than I do about trying to deal with the anxiety that I know is going to come from trying to quote unquote get better. Yeah. So it was literally that moment where I made the decision to try. And it was not at all linear in terms of I'd take a few steps forward, a couple of steps back, few steps forward, couple of steps back. But I did really start to try then, and it was probably still took me a good few years to really get to a point where I was first physically recovered in terms of in a healthy body weight and eating enough food. And I did, in my journey of recovery, go through a few other disordered eating patterns in terms of I started binge eating and I had bulimia for a bit. And I think that's relatively common for some other people going through recovery. And again, it comes back to that control. But I still, persisted forward and tried to get support in terms of I continued to seek out therapy and was very lucky to have supportive, very neutral friends that didn't give a shit how I looked and also weren't very focused on that themselves, which I think helped. And, as the time went on, the next kind of part in my journey that was quite significant was from doing all that, I probably started to kind of go from an anorexia and an eating disorder in that way to more being a bit orthorexic, and also had still quite a strong exercise addiction because I was using exercise then to manage my anxiety. Yeah. But at least I was fueling myself adequately for it. But what happened off the back of doing all of that is I essentially woke up one day I used to exercise 7 days a week, 2 hours a day, and could not take a break, or my anxiety would just be overwhelming. And so I, was recovered from anorexia, but definitely in that other space of still really not managing the underlying driver. And I woke up and I couldn't move my neck and my back was really sore, and I hadn't actually injured myself. Nothing had happened, but I was freaking out because I was like, how am I going to exercise? So I went to the physio that day and they said, you just need to rest. And again, I was just overwhelmed with anxiety because I was like, rest, I have not rested like my whole life. And they said just a few days. So I managed to coach myself through that. I was like, okay, we can do just a few days. But as the time went on, my pain got worse. And to cut a long story short, I ended up not being able to walk more than 10 to 15 meters, sleeping in a neck brace, had all this pain in my neck and going down my back. And I went to spinal surgeons, chiropractors, physios, osteos, everyone. lots of scans done. No one could actually find anything structurally, physically wrong. And I kind of got put in the category of you've just got chronic pain that's unexplainable and you just have to learn to manage it. But with going from being someone who had developed their whole sense of identity and self-worth on being the fit one, the exerciser, the quote unquote healthy eater, and having that tool to manage my anxiety just gone pretty much overnight, I really I flung into more of like a depression and had definitely some bouts of suicidal ideation. And it was more in looking back, this sense of like, I've just lost everything I thought that I was.
Yeah.
And so trying to find that again was really difficult without the actual literal tool of anxiety management in the way of exercise. And looking back, I'm like, best thing that ever happened to me, because it really forced me to learn to love myself and appreciate myself for things that had nothing to do with, what my body could, how much exercise I was doing, what I knew, etc. But it was a really hard time. And off the back of all of that, in terms of going through anorexia, I definitely came out with heaps of hormone issues, a lot of gut issues, a lot of thyroid issues. And when I turned to conventional medicine to try and support me with that, it just was not working. And so that's what led me into, and at the time I was already studying dietetics. I was probably 3/4 of the way through my nutrition and dietetics degree. And it led me to go and seek out, naturopathy and natural medicine, and going on that journey of at first, healing my gut and healing my thyroid and my hormones, and then starting to be able to slowly exercise again, and just get my sense of, independence and freedom and young, youth back was really amazing. And I still and again, through that time, I was still didn't fling back into anorexia. I was still really conscious of how I looked and how I felt, but it wasn't disordered to the extent that it used to be. And then I think through that whole process, there was a lot of self-reflection and, deep diving on my own sense of self-worth. And I really made conscious choices as I was getting back into exercise to choose to put myself in different environments. I felt like I couldn't go back to the gyms that I used to go to because I didn't want to be the same person that I was prior. Yeah. So I started doing yoga. I, went to a functional gym that did more, performance-based exercise as opposed to like a bodybuilding style of gym where people knew me from previously, and so I didn't want to feel the weight of their judgment that my body had changed, and B, I just didn't want to be in an environment where how you looked felt like a focus. So I made conscious decisions in that way to shift, the environments that I was in and the way that I was showing up and the people I was choosing to spend time with. And that helped in making those changes a lot easier. And I think it was just time, it was really time and effort in actually also expanding my own internal resource kit of dealing with feelings and emotions that I found really challenging. And so rather than only having exercise or food restriction or controlling how I looked to deal with whatever emotions were coming up, I started to have more tools, and they came from so many different aspects, like yoga, doing my yoga teacher training, such a cliche, but it really did help me at the time. And then delving into therapy, but therapy that was based around psychosomatic healing. So the connection between your mind and your body rather than just talk therapy where we're understanding or developing self-awareness. It was more about how do I move this actually out of my physical body.
Oh.
And that really helped. And it was just this slow build on things over time. And I definitely think meeting my husband helped as well, just to develop more confidence because, he's very expressive with words of affirmation. And so to have that constant sense of feeling loved and desired or appreciated, I can't say that it was everything, but it certainly counted for something. And I think just really appreciating how much using food in a nourishing and medicinal way helped me heal from that pain that I experienced. That was really big for me as well, because instead of viewing food through the lens of calories and, earning something, I really was like, what can I add to my body to help nourish and heal me?
Yeah.
And so it was this constant shifting, almost of like addiction at first, and then starting to shift it into a place of self-nourishment, self-nurturance, to get to eventually where I am now, where I still deeply care about what I put in my body, and I make very intentional choices because it makes me feel good. But I don't feel anxiety around food. I don't feel guilt if I eat too much, or if I eat quote unquote the wrong thing, i.e. something that doesn't necessarily sit well with my body. I feel that the kind of relationship I have with food is very healthy and neutral. And from a body perspective, I'm like 20, 25 kilos heavier than I was at my lightest anorexic state. And, I have lots more muscle than I used to have, and I certainly have much more of like a womanly figure than I ever did in the past. And that's been a big journey to kind of, make this body feel like home to me, and because again, you live in a certain body type for a long time that just feels like it's what your normal is. And so it's been a journey of like landing in this body and being like, see, this is home. And it started with acceptance and then appreciation, and then now at a place of I just don't think about it as like a thing, really.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm still human, and if I'm feeling bloated or just fluidy because something's, moving through my body or whatever it might be, of course I don't feel my most attractive best self, and it's easier to like be a bit critical, but it feels a very like a normal transient thing that would be a moment in time versus weeks, months, years that just consume my thoughts. And it doesn't, how I feel in my body or those kind of conversations don't at all affect me showing up in my life or saying yes to things or saying no to things, or it's not connected to my sense of value. I still want to feel comfortable and confident in my body, but it's not that I need to look a certain way in order to feel loved or enough or appreciated. But it's been a bloody long slog to get here. And I will say that it's been because I've wanted to.
Yeah.
And that I've not given up on that. If I didn't want to, there's no way I would be where I'm at right now.
Yeah.
And I really believe that, and this I feel like is a thing that's said in this world of disordered eating, that they say once an eating disorder, always an eating disorder, but I really truly don't believe that. I feel like if you actually get to the source of what the eating disorder, the purpose that it was serving, because it's always serving a purpose, and you find other resources and ways to deal with that or process the emotions that weren't able to be processed at the time, that you absolutely can get to a place where, where I feel like I am now, which I would say is a much like a normal place of just being a normal human that tries to eat foods that make me feel good but doesn't feel guilt or shame when I don't, and feels, like I want to feel comfortable and confident in my body, but that it's not connected to my sense of like significance in the world.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for sharing your story, Nat. I think that was just so beautiful how you it's a beautiful story in the end, the way it came around. And I really liked what you were saying at the end about approaching your nutrition from a point of abundance and what do you need and how do you heal. And I just think that that's so beautiful. And I'm really conscious of that in my teachings with my clients, because we do deal in calories, but we're always talking about nutrition from a point of abundance, not just in versus out, because like you said, it can be really damaging if it's not approached properly. And I think, I don't want to speak on behalf of Alex, but I think that was a really, really valuable conversation for Alex, and to hear things from the other flip of the coin. But I know that she loves hearing the science behind things. So I know that was going to be really beneficial for her as well. So thank you so much. And I think that the listeners are going to get so much out of this. I am here, guys. I just wanted to sit back because I wanted Alex and Nat to have space to talk about their experience. So I just sat and listened today. But thank you so much. That was a really special conversation, and really proud of you both for sharing.
Thanks for sitting there as our emotional support.
Just a quick reminder that if there is anything in today's episode that has brought up something for you, you can contact the Butterfly Foundation and Lifeline, and our show notes will have the links for those.
If you found value in this episode and you think it will help someone you know, please send it to them. And if you'd like to leave us a review, you can do so on Apple Podcasts. Thank you.